Hello everyone. Today's lesson is going to be a bit of a consolidation of the work that you have been doing on gender roles and the domestic division of labour. I'm going to just talk through the key thinkers that you've already read about, just so that it's another way for you to kind of take it in, recap it, and hopefully I can explain anything that might not be clear in the pack. So here we go. As always, please email me if you have any questions at all. I'm just going to take you through, as I say, the key thinkers and their main kind of arguments. And I may say some things which are not written in your pack, and so you may want to annotate them, particularly in terms of like thinking about how to apply these key thinkers in the exam. So the first key thinker that you would have come across was Parsons. Now, the important thing to remember about Parsons whenever we're looking at his work, either in education or families, and also next year in beliefs, is that most of Parsons' work was written in sort of the mid-1900s, so 1950s, and therefore a lot of what he's saying may not apply necessarily to today. However, still a very important key thinker and very influential in sociology. And at that time, what he was saying was correct. So it's not that we can criticise him for being wrong, just that perhaps if he was alive today, then his work might have been a bit different, is what we're saying. But it is important to note that. So if you have a question about Parsons theory, if you have a question about family life today and you use Parsons in there, it's important to note in the exam that you know he wasn't writing today. You could use him to criticise other theorists and things like that, but it's important to recognise that he's not writing today. So Parsons in the 50s argued that the best way for the family to divide its labour was into segregated conjugal roles. So if you remember, conjugal roles are the roles that a man and a woman have in a relationship, or two partners have in a relationship. So anything that's conjugal, or you might have heard the word conjugal in like American series and things. Like in a prison, people get conjugal visits. That's when their partner comes to visit them. So this is a thing about kind of partners and how they have their roles in the relationship. So Parsons argues that they're segregated, so they are different, they have different roles, they're separate, very separate, and that these roles are normal and natural. And in particular, Parsons argues that the male would have the instrumental role and the female would have the expressive role. And again, that this is normal and natural. So he's a bit different to other sociologists because he doesn't go down this route of it being socially constructed. He actually thinks their roles are biologically suited to each other, to the particular genders. And that might be because, for example, women look after the children because they have the ability to breastfeed and they're the ones that carry them. Men are the breadwinners because they are naturally stronger, physically speaking. So we can criticise Parsons, as I was saying earlier, by suggesting that his theory is a bit outdated today. Now, it's not enough just to put in your essay. However, Parsons' theory is outdated. You need to develop that a bit more with the information I was talking about before. So while Parsons' theory may have been correct while he was writing, this is not necessarily true today. And then perhaps give another study that suggests how things have changed. For example, the next key thinkers we're going to look at are Wilmot and Young. I'll come to that in a second. Secondly, Parsons' idea can be criticised for being a bit patriarchal, for reproducing patriarchy, in that he is suggesting that the man should be the breadwinner, which means that they have more financial power and potentially more power in the family. And Parsons' theory really is just promoting this idea of the patriarchal nuclear family where the woman is dependent on the man for money. The woman does all the emotion work and the expressive role, and feminists would therefore criticise that and suggest that that is detrimental to the women in the family. So Wilmot and Young are also functionalists, but they were writing a bit later. So while Parsons might be outdated, we could then say, however, other theorists such as Wilmot and Young have developed Parsons' ideas about the nuclear family and recognised that they are no longer segregated, they are now more likely to be joint. So they are now much more symmetrical. So obviously if something is symmetrical, it means that if you put a line down the middle, it would be the same on both sides, like a butterfly. That's probably how you learnt it at primary school. So Wilmot and Young are arguing that that's what's happening now in the family, that the man on one side and the woman on the other have exactly the same roles. They both take part in paid work now. They both take part in the housework and the childcare, so it's much more equal. But Oakley then criticises Wilmot and Young. So they're all kind of telling this like story over time and criticising each other and having this debate. So Oakley then comes in to criticise Wilmot and Young, arguing that they got their research wrong. And in her research, she found that conjugal roles are still segregated, and that this is still very unfair and socially constructed. So what she was saying is that, yes, Wilmot and Young, I agree with you that women are now more likely to be in paid work, but that hasn't actually made things more equal. And that's because the roles within the home are still segregated, whereby women still do the majority of the housework and the childcare. And when men do participate in the domestic labour, they tend to do the things that are more masculine and perhaps maybe even the more fun and easy tasks. However, Oakley can be criticised due to her method. Sorry, I just want to note one more thing before I criticise. Oakley argues, therefore, that women actually now have a dual burden, so they have to do two things, paid work and housework, whereas the men are still having it a bit easier in the family. So we can criticise her due to her method because it was quite a small sample and it was only in London and it was only women between 20 and 30, I believe. It says it in your packs if you want to double check. So very small and unrepresentative samples, so it may not be true for everywhere. Okay. Now, Duncombe and Marsden don't necessarily criticise Oakley, but they develop her idea. And they have stated that it's not just a dual burden that women face, it's not just two things, which are the paid work and housework. They actually have a triple shift. And the triple shift involves three things: paid work, housework like cleaning and things, and the third thing, the expressive role of the emotion work, and sort of giving all of their love and care to the children and to the family. So if you think about it in your own family, when a child is upset in your own family, think about who it is that's most likely to comfort them. Think about when a child is off sick from school, which parent is most likely to stay home with them? Which parent gives the most cuddles and things? Now, you might not have the experience that Duncombe and Marsden are talking about. You might have a different experience. But Duncombe and Marsden are arguing that, generally speaking, the women are the ones that take on all of this emotion work and caring work. And all of this obviously is unpaid, so therefore they're being exploited. However, some sociologists argue that there has been a rise of something called the new man. Now, I don't think that this is in your pack, but it would be worth pausing this video actually and doing some research on new man sociology and seeing what you can find. But this really is the idea that masculinity, the idea of masculinity has really changed today, and that there's like new forms of masculinity whereby men are embracing their more sensitive and emotional and feminine side, and therefore taking more part in things like childcare and housework and emotion work in particular. Not so much the housework, I guess, but more like the childcare and the emotion work. So again, that is starting to change, and it would be great if you could find some research on that. Do share it if you find any. We've then got Gershony, who argues that things are changing, things are becoming more equal in terms of the domestic division of labour. Men and women are starting to do more similar things and share things more equally. But the women are adapting more quickly than the men. So the women are adapting and going out and doing paid work, but the men are not quite yet fully adapted to doing their share of the housework. So Gershony calls this lagged adaptation. The men are sort of lagging behind in their adaptation to the more equal roles. So you could use this in an essay or something to criticise this idea by Wilmot and Young that they are symmetrical today, and explain that actually they are getting there, they're on their way to being symmetrical, but Gershony has argued that the men are lagging behind a bit. There's lagged adaptation, they're not adapting as quickly as the women. Silver and Shaw argue that things are more equal now because of the commercialisation of housework. This is the idea that there's much more kind of technology in place now to make housework easier and more fun. So therefore they're arguing that men are more likely to be involved in housework today because it's more fun and it uses technology and things like that, and it's easier as well. So they're kind of arguing that things are improving due to that. However, they do still have this same point of view that the men are the ones doing the kind of more easygoing, fun tasks. And finally, we've got Dunn, and Dunn points out that we cannot generalise all families and suggest that all families have a man and a woman at home. And Dunn did some research into lesbian couples and found that lesbian couples are actually much more equal than heterosexual couples. And she argued that this is because in a lesbian, let's start with in a straight couple, in a heterosexual couple, there's these gendered expectations that we're socialised into. And she calls those gender scripts. So in the same way that you'd have a script in a play, if you were performing in a play, Dunn is arguing that your gender has a particular script that you follow in terms of like domestic labour and all other things within the home, the roles that you play. So Dunn argues that lesbian couples don't have this. They don't have a gender script because they're both women. So all of the jobs within the home, they have to negotiate, and that is done much more fairly than it is in a heterosexual relationship. Oh, click onto that slide. Just to carry on talking about Dunn quickly, she did find, however, that the woman in the relationship with the higher income did seem to do less housework. So you can evaluate Dunn's argument with kind of her own study, really, that she did find that although it was much more equal, pay was still a bit of an issue, and like the instrumental and expressive roles were still there somewhat. Okay, you then learned a little bit about post-modernity and how greater choice has led to greater opportunity for equality and more choice for family structures. And you may have read some things about negotiated families and negotiated roles, and the ways that we negotiate the things that we do within the family now due to greater choice. So that's because there's like more acceptance to things like house husbands and the new man, for example, that I was talking about before. All of these changes have occurred, which mean that in postmodern society there's more choice. But feminists would argue that these opportunities are not always taken up by women because we still have patriarchy in society, which still prevents and kind of still reproduces traditional roles and expectations. And then you would have read a little bit about globalisation and the impact of globalisation on the domestic labour within the home. So, for example, Caribbean families are more likely to be female-led, potentially with an absent father. So the woman has all of the responsibility for everything, for the paid work and the housework and the emotion work, with no support. South Asian families have more traditional gender roles, And the growth of globalization has also led to more people purchasing family personal care. So that means paying people to come from another country to be, for example, like an au pair. An au pair is like a live-in nanny who does the cleaning and the looking after the children and that kind of thing. So there's been a growing trend of that, and it's something that British young people do as well. They go to places like America and things to be an au pair, or foreign speaking countries so they can practice their language, and it's a great way to sort of earn some money and see a different culture and things. So that is happening more and more. So the point with globalization here is that due to globalization, people from these different cultures are migrating around the world, and for example moving to the UK, which means that we have more of these types of families and types of divisions of labour within the UK. So if there is a growing amount of South Asian families, that means that there's also a growing amount of families that have a traditional domestic division of labour. That's the key point there, really. If there's a growth of Caribbean families, that means that there is a growth in matrifocal female-led families. And if there's more and more people purchasing home care, nannies and things, that also affects the domestic division of labour, because it may, if there is a mother in the family, take the pressure off the mum. She wouldn't have to do much of the housework and some of the emotion work as well, that kind of thing. And there's an article, I believe, in your pack about how there's 1 million more people employing a cleaner than a decade ago. So that might be because of things like our rising living standards and rising sort of average income. But I would say it's really important to note that this is like a middle class phenomenon. There are also millions of people who cannot afford a cleaner and would never in a million years consider having a cleaner or home help. So it's really important to note that there is a class issue there. You can't generalise that to the whole population, and we couldn't suggest that in a few years' time everyone would have a cleaner. That's not the point. The point is that there are many more people enlisting help. Now that may be because of things like more women being in paid work, for example, so they haven't got the time to clean like they would have done previously. And as I was saying before, higher living standards and that kind of thing as well. So what I wanted to do is give you a chance to have a little look at a question. Now, what I'm going to ask you to do for this time is just make some notes on what I am saying about this question, and I've got a little plan on the next slide, but you need to finish the topic by looking at power relationships before you can properly answer it. But we can answer half of it at the moment. So we're gonna do half of it now, and then we're gonna build on it later once we have done the relevant stuff. Okay, so this question then is asking you to evaluate the view that the division of labour and power relationships in couples are equal in modern day family life. Now I've highlighted power relationships in a different colour because we can't do that at the moment. We can't, that's the bit that we don't know about. Well, I know about, but you don't. Oh dear, that doesn't look very good. That's meant to be just a cross because we can't do that one at the minute. However, we can think about this view that the division of labour is more equal in modern family life today. We can think about this part here, the division of labour. So this question is asking you to take the view that the division of labour is more equal and then evaluate it and criticise it. And it's asking you also to use the item. So there are some parts of the item that we could use here. For example, some sociologists argue that changes within the family and in wider society. Changes within the family might be things like women in the family going out to work more, that kind of thing. Family diversity increasing, so perhaps more lesbian couples, and you could link to Dunn's research. So different expectations within the family and that kind of thing. In wider society, the changes in wider society are that women are able to go out into paid work now, and you could link to things like the Equal Pay Act and the Sex Discrimination Act that have influenced those. So there's much more equality in wider society, and there's much more acceptance of women working. There's also much more acceptance of men taking part in the housework and the childcare and everything as well. So there's sort of changing expectations of men and the idea of the new man that we were talking about previously. By the way, I don't think I said this at the start, but it would be a good idea to pause this and either sort of print screen it and print it out, or write it down. So write down the whole question and the item so you can annotate these notes as well. So rewind if you need to, pause and write it all down. The next part that I've highlighted is domestic tasks. So the way in which domestic tasks are allocated is more equal. So that's the things that we've been talking about here. You could use Wilmot and Young here to talk about how they argue that the family is more symmetrical. And of course you can criticise that with Oakley, saying that it's not more symmetrical. Both partners are likely to be in paid employments. This is a big influential issue in terms of the domestic division of labour. It's one of the big reasons why the domestic division of labour has changed. This sharing of responsibilities has led to more equal power relationships. Now, again, I've done that in a different colour because we can't address that part of the question just yet, but we will do when we get to that part later. When we're looking at power relationships, we're not just looking at how the tasks are divided, we're looking at who has the most power economically, physically and emotionally, and who makes the decisions in the family and those kinds of things. So we'll come to that later. So as always, you have got an intro and a conclusion, and for this question I think it is good to have 4 paragraphs in the middle, but potentially 4 short paragraphs. And if you did run out of time and only did 3 but did them really well, that would be absolutely fine. But I'd like us to plan 4 so that we can do an equal amount of DDOL and power relationships. You wouldn't actually have to do that in the real exam. It doesn't have to be equal. You just have to mention both of them. But just for the sake of consolidating knowledge and getting it all down on paper, we're going to do 4 paragraphs for this one. So the introduction, it's important to summarise the key terms like division of labour and power relationships, and then address the question with a simple sentence such as, while some sociologists argue the family has become more equal, others disagree. So people tend to be a bit scared of introductions, I think, and a bit like, I don't know where to start. But if you remember those 2 simple things, summarise any key terms or any trends that are in the question, such as if you had a question about like divorce, you might say divorce has increased in the last 100 years. But yes, so summarise the key terms if you don't know where to start, and then a simple sentence to address the question. Normally you can put something along the lines of, while some sociologists argue this, others disagree and argue this. So something like that. Okay, I would then recommend that we start with Wilmot and Young, because we want to start by supporting the view that the family has become more equal, because that's the view in the question. We want to start with that and then criticise it. So Wilmot and Young argue that that the family is more symmetrical today. And then we might evaluate with Oakley and the dual burden, and then we could say Duncan and Marsden developed this with our idea of the triple shift, and it's great to show off analysis like that. That is analysis where you're saying that Oakley says this, however this is developed by Duncan and Marsden, who argue this. So it's not a criticism, it's a development. That's what analysis is, development. Okay, you then might put something about how in postmodern society there's much more equality. Cohabitation is more equal than marriage. That is something you're going to look at a little bit later, but I've put it in because I think it's a really important point that key thinker called Beijing argues that living together without being married is more equal, because once you get married you take these vows that are sometimes a bit patriarchal, and you sort of end up following the traditional expectations of a married couple. But Beijing argues that if you stay cohabiting, then that tends to be much more equal. Pure relationships are more equal and have less tradition attached to them. So, for example, Giddens would talk about that, and how if you're in a pure relationship out of choice and out of love, things tend to be a bit more negotiated rather than just being in a relationship for the practical things and therefore following expectation. And you could link there to Dunn. Remember, Giddens argues that same-sex couples are like the pioneers of the pure relationship. So Dunn is a really good example of this, in that lesbian couples are much more equal, according to Dunn. However, Gershony argues that things are changing, but it's not equal yet due to lagged adaptation. And if we look at globalization, which is an important part of postmodernism, postmodern society, we can see that other cultures, such as South Asian cultures, are more traditional and less equal. So we can't do the next couple of bits in the conclusion, but we will come to that later and we'll keep building on it. So I would like you to make sure, please, pause the video and get this plan written down. You could, if you wanted to, if you are twiddling your thumbs and want something extra to do, then you could have a go at sort of starting to write in full the introduction and these 2 paragraphs, because eventually I'm going to ask you to write the whole essay in full. So it's up to you whether you want to do the first 2 paragraphs now, so it's like half done, and then you can just do the other half later when we plan it, or if you want to just save it all until the end and do it all in one go. I don't mind, but over the next couple of lessons, I'm going to be asking you to send me the full answer to this as your marked piece of work. Okay. The next issue that I'm going to get you to look at is the role of grandparents. And this is really important in the context that life expectancy is much longer today than it was in the past. So therefore, grandparents are around more than they would have been in the past. There are more grandparents that are existing, and therefore that has had an impact on the domestic division of labour. So just in preparation for your next lesson about the role of grandparents, I'd like you to have a think about these questions that I've put on the screen. So what role have grandparents played in your life? Did or do they get involved with childcare? So have they looked after you, taken some of that role away from from your sort of nuclear family members? Have they helped with domestic labour? So some people might have grandparents come around and do a bit of cleaning to help out the family, or do a bit of washing or ironing or whatever. So, and ultimately, how might longer life expectancy and therefore having more grandparents around have influenced the domestic division of labour in the family? I'd like you to really think about that last question. How will having grandparents around have affected the domestic division of labour in the family? So think about who will have been most affected by it, the man or the woman maybe. Think about the role of grandparents in looking after children and how that might lead to both parents being able to work in paid work. So anything you can think of, have a think about it before you do the next lesson, which I'm going to send out via PowerPoint. Okay, thanks very much everybody. Please let me know if you've got any questions at all and I will answer them, and talk to you soon. Bye.